Hi everyone, welcome to the last program for the Vancouver Art Book Fair. If you're just tuning in right now, my name is Vivian Sming, pronouns she, her, they, them, and I publish artist books through my studio, Sming Sming Books, and I'm the guest curator for this year's virtual program. The Vancouver Art Book Fair is committed to the advancement, appreciation, and circulation of artist publishing. The fair and program, the last program for the Vancouver Art Book Fair. Oh, sorry. PJ, can you? There's like, can you mute? Okay, cool. Sorry about that. The fair and programs are free and open to the public, so please consider joining the membership program, which helps pay artist fees and keeps these events free and accessible. And we'll share the link for you all to sign up. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the Vancouver Art Book Fair does take place on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm streaming here from my home in the Bay Area on the land of the Muwekma Ohlone people. And as we are here to talk about books and publishing, I also want to acknowledge the very many histories and languages that have been erased through the prioritization of paper as being the only source of history, legitimacy, and value. So these 2 days of programs have really been a way to understand how publishing can be a site of resistance, restoration, contestation, and imagination. So thank you for joining us. I'm excited to introduce PJ Gubatina Policarpio and Demian DinéYazhi, who will be in conversation about how books and publishing appear in Demian's work. PJ is an educator, curator, and community organizer. He has organized exhibitions, publications, public programs at Southern Exposure, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Asian Art Museum, Dixon Place, and Nurture Art. PJ is the co-founder of Filipinx American Library, an itinerant library dedicated to the Filipinx perspectives. Born in the Philippines, PJ lives and works between San Francisco and New York City. Demian DinéYazhi is a Portland-based Diné transdisciplinary artist, poet, and curator, born to the clans Nasaje Tabaha and Todi-Chini. Their practice is a regurgitation of purported decolonial praxis informed by the over-accumulation and exploitative supremacist nature of hetero cisgender communities and post-colonization. They are a survivor of attempted European genocide, forced assimilation, manipulation, sexual and gender violence, capitalist sabotage, and hyper-marginalization in a colonized country that refuses to center its politics and philosophies around the indigenous peoples whose land it occupies and refuses to give back. They live and work in a post-apocalyptic world, unafraid to fail. So with that, here is PJ and Demian.
Hi, everyone. My name is PJ. I am so thrilled and honored to be here today and be in conversation with Demian here. Thank you, Vivian, for the invitation. And I also want to acknowledge that I am zooming in today from the traditional unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people and want to pay tribute to all all the stewards of this land, past, present, and future for all time. So the way I'm going to kind of organize this conversation is I'm going to be talking kind of in a bit of a meandering, non-chronological way and ask Demian about some of the works that's available. So I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint to kind of share and visualize some of the work as well. So as I do that, I'm going to let Demian introduce your work and yourself.
Yate, my name is Demian DinéYazhi. I'm born to the clans Nastaje Tabahe and Todi-Chini of the Diné tribe. I currently live in Portland, Oregon, which is the ancestral homelands to a variety of tribes, including Cowlitz, Kalapuya, the Chinook, Multnomah, and just various bands. But today I'm zooming in from Flagstaff, Arizona, which is the ancestral homelands of the Hohokam, Pueblo, and Hopi, as well as the Western Apache tribe. I think it's also important to state that, even though we are doing a lot of facilitating this conversation through the internet, it's also important to understand that the internet itself and the ways that we engage with the internet and social media is continually through the lens of settler colonialism. And in order to utilize these technologies, we also need to take into consideration the fact that a lot of these technologies, are afforded to us through gentrification and the continued removal of Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities. So with that, I want to turn it over to PJ to kind of begin.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's always important to note, as we work now virtually and remotely, that technology is neither equitable nor equal. So thanks for that. I really want to begin. I'm hoping to have kind of a more of a wide ranging conversation, and hopefully, to try and be as poetic as you are in your work. So I really just want to start my first question is really, who are you committed to, and who is committed to you? And you can take that in any way you want.
Oh, yeah, that's a difficult question. And I think it's something that, we definitely have had to take into consideration during a pandemic, and everything that we're going through as a society right now with our communities. I feel I'm committed to Indigenous communities and tribes. And I feel like that has always been a thread that has been apparent, prior to my work, but also as I've developed my work and evolved my creative practice. It's something that was definitely ingrained into me through my family, my ancestry, my parents, where I'm from, ceremony and creation stories and cosmological sort of understandings of who we are as Indigenous people, as Indigenous Diné people, I should say. I'm from the Diné tribe. And so I feel like as I've developed my creative practice, I really couldn't do it without acknowledging ancestries that came before me and that were really responsible for the ways that I engage with the world, the way that I filter understanding of the world. I feel like a lot of my earlier work was about honoring these voices and intelligent people who came before, who were from Indigenous ancestries or queer ancestries, who really helped shape both my politics, but also the aesthetics that I've come to adopt. And so I feel like that's a lot of the work that I'm currently engaged in, and that's the community that I'm dedicated to, and committed to trying to build space for. And I've been very fortunate to be allowed access to those communities. And I've also, been very lucky and fortunate to have been able to work through a initiative I know that I founded known as RISE, which is Radical Indigenous Survivance and Empowerment, which has really allowed me to kind of push things to the next level, work with a variety of Indigenous artists, focus on what Indigenous curation and programming and organization looks like, Indigenous queer aesthetics, what that looks like, but also what it looks like to be able to fund and help support your own community. And we're about to go into our third year of self-funded fellowship for Indigenous artists, and I'm hoping that this year we're able to fund even more people. But yeah, Indigenous, queer, trans, gender gradient, non-conforming, non-binary individuals, feminist and matriarchal voices. Like those are, since like my, you know, really introduction and move into creating artwork, that's been the community that I have wanted to help support, because growing up in like a shit small town, you just didn't have that support. I didn't have that support, and I didn't feel like I was able to really find that. And I think it's important for younger generations to thrive and not have to worry about whether we fit in or not.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that kind of that thought, your response really brings me to two different threads that I want to touch on today as well. The first is, you know, really growing up in kind of surrounded by the Diné culture and you know these kind of cosmological ideas, you know, the ceremony. So that's one that I want to kind of talk about. And then there's also this idea of the kinship and the care of the collective, right? Working as an editor, as a curator, advocating and supporting networks of artists, of Indigenous bearers and culture makers. So that's another one. But right now I want to kind of think back into, you know, kind of your beginning and growing up, you know, around and family, and really thinking about what that has brought you and what that has given you, and also you know, in relation to the artwork here with the soil and the coal. So I just kind of want to think and hear from you how, you know, how this, you know, has really translated and kind of enter your practice and your making. And if you feel free to talk about the artwork here briefly if you'd like as well.
Yeah, this work is it's inspired by the Navajo Code Talker dictionary. My grandfather was a code talker back in the day. Usually if this conversation was being had in public, I would ask people, how many of y'all know like what a code talker is? And so a code talker was someone who was enlisted into the US Army and during World War II. My grandfather was removed from his classroom and was signed up and enlisted into the Army, into the Marines. And so they developed this language crypt that allowed the US Army to successfully create a code against the enemy. It was very successful in winning the war, but also prior to this, Navajo or Diné Pequeya wasn't a written language. It was all oral. So a lot of my work also really talks about this complicated relationship that Indigenous people have with language, forced assimilation into English, but also just how just how fucked up it is that our language comes into the written form through the act of colonial warfare. And then and so I forget the title of this piece, but I reference the Navajo Code Talker dictionary, and I use the translation. So the dirt on the one side of the photograph translates to native land, and then I believe the one on the right, of all the coal, translates to land wound without protection. And that is pointing to the extractive industries that exist on the reservation. And so I had bought this coal on the side of the road from, you know, just another Indigenous Diné person who was selling it, you know, probably got it from one of the coal mines. When we were kids, you know, we had a coal burning stove. And so, every so often we would have to go down to the coal yard, whatever, and like there were just these like large expansive like rows of coal, where you could load up just a ton of it into the back of your car. And that was how that is probably still how some people on the reservation like provide um provide warmth for themselves in the winter. It's very cheap, it's affordable, it's very unhealthy. But I would just see like these like old grandmas and old grandpas just like, you know, picking up giant pieces of coal and throwing it into the back of their car. But I didn't really understand like just how entangled we were into this relationship, into this history of like extraction within the reservation. I had not even known or understood like the complicated relationship Indigenous Diné people have like with uranium extraction, and how close some of these like EPA Superfund sites are to the place that I grew up, and how it's just like devastated my own homelands and my people. And so the dirt on the right is kind of like speaking to it's holding space for other aspects like of the land that have ties to indigeneity, indigenous bodies. And so this piece is kind of referencing more this cosmological and ceremonial aspect, as well as philosophies that exist within like Indigenous Diné culture. And so this piece was really important for me because in order for me to successfully show it, it involved me transporting that dirt from my grandparents' land on the reservation all the way up to Portland. And so this was on view in a show that I had with this other artist, Kaylee Spitzer, called Dene Bahi Na'abahi. And so in showing this piece, it's me like showing a longer term commitment and dedication to my community. It's also opening up this conversation about migration. And then it also has this other element to it, which isn't really shown here, but I is only really known when I talk about it, of the ways that Indigenous artwork is handled like through the institution. So in order for me to show both of these pieces had to either be frozen or baked, so everything living inside of these pieces would die. Like everything has to be dead to a certain degree within like Western institutions in order for it to be shown. So, that was just like a mind fuck for me. Just the fact that like, in order for me to show the work that I wanted to show as an Indigenous artist, even my own homeland, like just dirt, something that is like so sacred and beautiful, it had to go through this like extra process of death in order for it to be shown. And that's, it exists with all these other different objects in the museum that have also been like, taken and stolen from Indigenous communities, and not given back. Like, it's institutions and art handlers and collections that feel that they're more adept or worthy of holding on to our past than we are. So I also realized that a lot of the objects that exist within collections, they still have their own life cycle. So anyway, I'm sorry, this is kind of going off topic here, but this piece is also about the sacredness of land and ceremony. And so where this dirt was taken from is where a lot of our own family ceremonies have taken place. It's right next to where we had dug into the earth to make way for kinalda cakes that are baked into the earth for like feminine ceremonies. And so yeah, this piece has so many different layers to it.
Sure.
But it also is kind of like this like fuck you to institutions and spaces, because this piece, you know, can never be collected. It could never, because
Can never
it
exist.
has to return to the original site and it has to go back into the land. It it defies that colonial logic.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because we're at you know, like a book fair kind of context. To me, it also speaks, you know, it also looks like a book. It could be, you know, a page from this kind of book, and the way that it's presented here in this kind of box form, you know, what does it mean again for text to not be text, you know, for the soil and the coal to be text. So yeah, I think it's so many layers. And so I'm just, you know, curious now, you were born in Gallup in New Mexico and grew up there, but are kind of, you know, more based in Portland now and also traveling. I'm wondering what your relationship is to that homeland specifically. You know, how do you often, you know, this work here called Res Dog, Res Dirt is about, you know, a return to this at one time. So I'm just wondering what your relationship is now to that place and that land.
It's, I mean, I don't feel like it necessarily changes. I still feel connected in the same ways.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel fortunate that that I'm able to heal in like different places. You know, I'm not, you know, my ancestral homelands aren't the Pacific Northwest, but a lot of like my own healing and coming into who I am as an Indigenous person, as a queer person, as a non-binary person, you know, a lot of that has come from like engaging with that space. I always want to move from Portland. Like I get so much slack for like living in like this white liberal paradise, but I keep, you know, reminding other people and myself at the same time that like there is a lot of like really amazing Indigenous people there. There's a lot of amazing brown, Pacific Islander, Asian, Black communities there who are just doing a lot of amazing things. I feel like so safe as like a queer and non-binary person. I mean, that might be foolish to a certain degree. I don't think any of us are safe, but I feel like it's just easier for myself to exist there, to be myself in a way that I'm not able to, because colonization and assimilation has just devastated the place that I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
But when I go back to where I'm from and I engage with the land, and I feel immediately at home. I don't think that that's just because I was born there. I don't think that's just because I was raised there. I think there's just that area is just like teeming with like so much knowledge, so much intention, so much creation and care and ceremony that I'm just not able to access in a place like Portland. So I will be forever like not necessarily indebted. I don't like thinking of it in necessarily in that way. But you know, for the sake of Western terminology, but like I will always feel at my strongest, at my fullest, within Dene, like there's this cosmological concept known as Haja, and I will always feel more embodied within that, within like the four sacred home or the four sacred mountains of my ancestral homelands. And this piece, you know, is sort of pointing that the text was taken from Joy Harjo, who's a Muskogee Creek poet. But overlaid is this wonderful text or spoken word text that I had just done stream of consciously on that land, like not very far from where I dug up that dirt. So again, it's just like referencing like where we are from, the pride of that space and who we are as like Indigenous people.
Thank you. I love also the way that you speak to migration and movement as a way to find safety. Which I think it's become so contentious, right? The idea that you could be in a place where you need to be.
Yeah.
How has it been so contentious, and who gets to decide where you can go? And so I think that kind of speaks to that, and you really spoke beautifully. Now I'm going to move to the piece that we actually worked on, so bringing this here in San Francisco for us, and you told me the story of kind of behind this work, but I want you to kind of maybe just share with us, since this idea here of books and this kind of knowledge creation and text and things that are written down and things that are archived and held in knowledge and information that are held in this book form, and that you've kind of transposed and created into a monument, almost kind of a larger than life, and just to show you scale of how it is. It's kind of taller in this space. So I want you to just share about this work and what it means. And I know that people often see this work and think it's all kind of really important text, but there's actually some text here that are also problematic, that are also colonial. So I wonder what the choice and decision was to kind of create this mix of information.
Yeah, thanks. I know we had the conversation too going into it, that I was like, oh, it would be great to remake this piece.
Yes,
And
to add on. Yeah.
right. Or like remove
Right.
Sherman Alexie, for instance.
Right. Yeah.
But also like I mean, you also enter into the work and you realize that like that problematic patriarchal crap is like always going to be there.
Yeah.
I mean, Ishi is there, and anthropology has a complicated history, and such. So yeah, no, this is a was an interesting piece in creating it, because yeah, I mean, as you like mentioned earlier, there are problematic texts in here. If I could do it again, and especially like since it's been made like in 2016, I feel like there's been so many amazing books by Indigenous people, by Black folks, by queer folks and trans folks, like some who are my own friends, who I'm like, I am learning so much from you. And like I want to honor you. Like I feel like it was important for me to read Adrienne Rich at one point, but like why don't I change it up and put a contemporary poet like Joss Barton into the mix, who I've like learned so much from, as like as a Joss is an amazing, brilliant trans poet, living and working out of St. Louis, Missouri. I think of this piece as like just honoring so much of that community, of wanting to find community, and the ways that I went about that was through academia, was through reading. The ways that I've come into being validated as like an Indigenous writer, curator, and artist has always been in this like non-conventional, subversive way, and it wasn't through institutions initially. It was through Tumblr and social media. It was like people who just came across things that I was posting and it resonated with them. And so I feel like this piece, like it when I made it, I was probably in my like, oh my God, 33, 34 at the time. And it took me that long in order for me to make this piece. It took me that long to come across all these works and, you know, create context for it. This piece is titled Untitled Radical Indigenous Queer Feminist Bibliography. And it's about creating like a framework for that type of like mindset or ideological research to exist within. I felt like it was really difficult for me to like find spaces and find community to have these conversations. And so in creating this piece, it was sort of me putting that out there and saying, hey, like, if any of y'all wanted to read this like bibliography, like we could sit down and have a conversation. We could create work together. We could, you know, dream of like better futures together. And this isn't like the perfect template, but like this is, you know, creating access for people who maybe aren't interested or don't have access or aren't able to you know, really delve into the academic world. I was, you know, a bibliography and a syllabus is something that is are very privileged documents that not everyone has access to. A lot of the times too, they are made by white cisgender professors. And so I was really thinking about like how like a syllabus or a bibliography is a powerful thing when it's an indigenous brown or black person who is creating the context for it. And so this was sort of my way to do that, to put it out there and allow other people who don't have access the ability to have access to these books. I just think that, you know, it just needs to be updated at this point.
Yeah. Well, I think listening to you, you know, speak about this again, and we've you know had conversations about this. I think what's coming clear to me is that, you know, this was a snapshot of that kind of knowledge making and thoughts that you had access to in 2016, and we all grow and evolve and change. And I think that, you know, just as, you know, curriculum and syllabi change, you know, this, you know, can also change. So I think there's an opportunity for that. But I think that what's also important in kind of leaving those problematic text is that, you know, once a text is out there, once a book is out there, it's hard to pull them back, right? Like you can't say that this text doesn't exist anymore. You can't say that, you know, you can't kind of wish it away. You know, you can't, you know, those life series, you know, can't not exist, right? It's already out, it's out in the world. So I think that that kind of makes that clear as well. And we have now choices and you know, and people are authoring and self-authoring, and you have been definitely writing and authoring and making books and publishing. So, you know, I think, you know, I'm excited to see the other ways that that works shift and evolve. And, you know, and I think thinking about, you know, archive, you know, I think that that work serves as a sort of an archive, a snapshot of a moment. But you also work so deeply and mine, you know, kind of archives in general, you know, from maps to images, paintings, whatever that is around, and you kind of supersede them with kind of these poetic kind of cutting statements that, you know, are straight to the point. And one of those, that series is this land is not your land, was not your land, will never be your land. And it comes in through, you know, different you know, backdrops. And so I kind of just want to you know, hear from you, you know, kind of the idea around this work, you know, kind of the text, this poetic text. And, you know, this is done through, of course, RISE, which is your initiative. And here we have the maps, and I think these two, I have two different versions. So, you know, how do you find the maps, and how do you kind of connect this, and how do you source the materials, and how do you choose the text that comes on top of it?
Well, for this series, it's all the same text.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so the map just
Change
changes.
it, yeah.
And the maps are like pointing toward, I try to find like the earliest version of the map of like when those colonial boundaries were first etched or sketched. And so, I mean, this one is like the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, and I created it during the no DAPL, no Dakota Access Pipeline resistance. The other one was the Mashpee. The first one that I initially created was of the Western Hemisphere, and I was kind of thinking about, of course, that Woody Guthrie song, you know, "This land is your land, this land is my land."
Yeah.
And I was obviously thinking about like childhood and how ideas of like nationality and patriotism get embedded into who we are, and how problematic that is, and how growing up, coming into adulthood, like just how disgusting that feels, or how it at least felt for me. I mean, there's millions of people out there who are still like drinking the Kool-Aid and think that settler colonialism is great, and that their anti-indigenous, anti-native sentiments are valid, and their anti-black and racist propaganda is like legitimate. It's not, but like there's enough of them out there that like we are where we are today. We are where we are right now. And it's through this like early brainwashing. It's through the settler colonial project subverting even a song by Woody Guthrie, which was originally written about people like vagabonds and people who were living houseless and living on the streets, and like just moving through the country freely. I mean, this is what that song is about. It's about really like standing up to like capitalism, but it gets subverted through a national agenda, and of unifying and brainwashing kids into believing that America is this great paradise. And so I really wanted to challenge that again and push it in a way that I feel like even Woody Guthrie, the original author of the song, would resonate with.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, I feel like, take immediate offense to this, because a lot of what I do with language and the ways that I work with language is I immediately start to other people in a way that like I have felt othered. It's like it's a very subversive and
And you
unnerving.
confront, yeah.
But it's I don't know, I think it's great, because I think people in feeling othered automatically assume that like this text, "This land is not your land, was not your land, will never be your land," is like specifically for white people. And it's for everyone. It's even for Indigenous people who like feel like I mean, right now, there's just like throughout First Nations Canada and the United States, but primarily in First Nations Canada, there's like this push for like this land back movement. And it's about like, of I feel like it's about like giving the land back to itself. It's even, it's I think some people assume that it's about like purely Indigenous like stewardship and sovereignty, but like, and I do feel like Indigenous people like should have we should have our ancestral lands given back to us. But I also think that there's a lot of Indigenous people who are problematic, who have been assimilated, who are like conservative, and whose like agendas are about like continuing extractive industries. And so I think this text is speaking to all people, because it's like this idea of land ownership, this idea of like permanence, is something that like that is a part of like the settler colonial agenda. Is something that like needs to be dismantled.
And I'm gonna I want you to think
No
about
worries.
kind of that, and I want to share, you know, speaking of, you know, giving land back. I think you recently were part of the Biennale in Sydney, Australia, and this is something that you know, that came out of that work. So I'm really curious to know how it was for you to sort of think about, you know, kind of diasporic indigeneity, and to connect and think about, you know, work, sharing work and showing work in Australia, and what's now Australia, and kind of that connection, I think. And yeah, and I think that, you know, the idea of land and land back, and so yeah, I want you to maybe share what it was like, that process, to think about a different, you know, land, you know, what's now Australia, and to kind of make those connections.
Yeah, it was great to be a part of, you know, the Sydney Biennale. Um, I, but I will say that like, I really wish that I was able to engage in a way that Rise would have normally engaged, which would have been like actually building relationships with Aboriginal communities. Um, you know, I'm still probably within, you know, the international lens and an emerging artist. And so I don't feel like I get as much support. I will say that they supported me like wonderfully. They are great, but I do feel that it would have been much more beneficial if there was an opportunity to engage in a way that like Rise would normally engage, which is to engage with Indigenous communities, which is to like build these relationships, have conversations, especially, you know, when, you know, we can give like land acknowledgements like all day, but like what does that actually mean? And so, you know, one way to as an Indigenous person to like come into this space, into Aboriginal Australia, um, I felt it was so important to create those conversations, to create those relationships, and there wasn't enough time to do that, unfortunately. And I wish that I had, um, you know, more funding on my own. I'm myself an autonomous artist. Um, you know, I don't have gallery support. I don't have representation. I don't have an agent or any of these things. Um, Everything that I do comes through like my own funding or grant support. So if I had like more of an opportunity to actually get funding as well, that could have been like a really good opportunity. But with that, you know, I feel like it was really great to actually be able to go there. They paid for me to come out. Um, I met like a ton of Aboriginal artists who are doing amazing things, who are like, I mean, that is like one thing that is like really inspiring and empowering about these opportunities, is like being able to actually engage with the artwork, to engage with the artist and have these conversations, and to actively see like the history of that space. Like to even to be able to go to like a museum or an institution and see like the struggles that like Aboriginal artists have even had to endure and able to even be in those spaces, like is like such is so profound. Like, you know, racism exists all over the world. It is very active and alive in Australia. And seeing the ways that Aboriginal communities have been excluded and erased and are trying to actively right now like become empowered, but also how like institutions like start to take credit for the ways that like even Aboriginal communities or Indigenous communities like like become empowered entities, like is such a mind trip. Um, anyway, I'm not answering the question maybe in a way that I feel that I wanted to, but it was also really interesting being able to go there because um, at the beginning, at the opening of the Biennale, the pandemic sort of hit. And so in the middle of all that, um, you know, I had to get out of Dodge. Like it was very, very intense.
Yeah, and I think thank you for that. And I think it's so interesting that you can kind of naturally connected to the pandemic. And I think one of the an aspect of your work and your practice that really connects with me and I found really strength is the way that you really insert queer politics. You know, the way that you insert indigenous um, subjectivity into queer politics and how you mix both and how you layer them, like such as in this work, you know, you layer queerness, queer politics, you know, AIDS politics with contact and colonialism and kind of, you know, and those ideas which can sometimes which aren't sometimes limited or aren't seen together. And I think that, you know, this again takes on such a relevance, you know, when we are in a pandemic that, you know, that largely still, you know, kills indigenous black and brown bodies when the state doesn't care, you know, and I think that kind of reverberations about, you know, around AIDS. Um, and so maybe you can just kind of talk a little bit about, you know, these connections, you know, and I think that, you know, you are unafraid to kind of separate, you know, the queer identity with the indigenous identity and multiple other identities, and you know how that kind of shows up in these kind of layered works, I think is just so strong. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to share a few other slides that kind of relate to this part of your practice.
Yeah, I mean, I was creating this, I began creating that work because I was, you know, really interested in creating this relationship between Indigenous communities and queer communities, which I don't think are necessarily like that different. But I will say that like also queer communities can be hella anti-Indigenous. Like, yeah, sorry, white queer politics is completely exclusionary of its ties to like settler colonialism. Trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming history as well, I feel like a lot of the times leaves out Indigenous sexualities and Indigenous gender systems that, you know, existed in, you know, what most or what a lot of Indigenous communities refer to as Turtle Island. So it's a complicated topic. It's complicated work to make because I get shit on like either side, on, you know, within like the queer realm and also within like even contemporary Indigenous artists or contemporary Indigenous queer artists who don't think that I should be making these associations. And I don't think that it's necessarily fair because we Indigenous people have had to endure our own genocides. We have and queer people have had to endure our own genocides as well. Trans people are being murdered, you know, every single day in America. Some reported, some not. And so the ties that I feel like I try to make with this, while I feel like it's important to state, you know, in Indigenous and queer context, you know, I think it's also important to take into consideration like just cosmological ties and the ways that we as individuals have been forced to separate ourselves from something as sacred as cosmology. Um, so I feel like within this work, like it's important to state the ways that the state itself is responsible for our deaths. How genocide and pandemics and epidemics are used as ways to silence us and kill us again. It's happening right now, you know, like numbers are going up. I was just in Gallup, New Mexico, and the numbers go up in that region. And it's disheartening, but at the same time, it's been happening, you know, for centuries. It's just something else that we have to endure as survivors of genocidal conquest.
Awesome. I have more. I like over prepared, but I wanna
Oh,
maybe
no worries.
and just a little bit, you know, bringing it back to the book fair and bringing it back to, you know, the ideas of publishing and publication. And your practice really kind of encompasses all of these things, you know, all of the works that we've talked about here. And I'm just going to read something that I actually found on your social media on Instagram that I think kind of captures your practice. So you write, all of our dreams of decolonization must turn into framework, exercises, mutual aid, zines, DIY companions, artwork, performance, rituals, poetry manuals, ceremonial offerings, savage kinship, untamed melodies, and love. And I think that, you know, you embody all of those things. Your practice is all of those things. So I'm wondering why you choose and how, you know, how do you choose what aspect the work comes out of? You know, if it's a poem or a visual or, you know, a book or a performance, how does that all come together for you?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm just thankful that I have different ways to show work. I don't know. Honestly, I'm not sure. I feel like first and foremost, a lot of the work that I create usually starts off with writing and poetry. Storytelling, remembering things from like my childhood, what my mom has told me or passed on to me. Yeah, I have no idea, but I think if I did one thing, I would just get completely bored of it. I think it's been really beneficial for me as a creator to think of different ways to do things. I also think that it's just an Indigenous praxis.
Practice. Yeah.
Like, yeah, I don't think that there's necessarily one thing that we should be doing, and also to be doing. I never want to be the master of something or anything. I think that that's a really just a dated and boring colonial concept to want to be the master of anything, to be a master artist. And so I feel like I just want to be able to try to do as many things as possible. I just want whether that means, you know, my work like is collected or exists in like 20, 50 or 1,000 years. I also try to create work that maybe even defies that is about disappearing, that is about like not leaving a trace behind, that is about like the impermanence of what it is to be human, to be like a part of this universe. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I totally, I get it. And I think it's, I don't mean for you to explain, but I just think that it's so interesting and it's so rich, you know, and I want to give a plug to Rise, and online you have, you know, incredible merchandise and things that people can actually buy and that you continually produce alongside all of your other works. So I think I'm going to stop sharing now and I'm going to open it up and bring up Vivian and other folks to see if they have room, if they have any questions or things like that.
I think we're actually out of time, but
Perfect.
we have shared, Demian, we have shared your Etsy page on the YouTube chat. So I really encourage folks to check that out. And also, the Instagrams handles are all in there. I just want to thank you both so much for taking the time and sharing that conversation. I think, it's giving everyone a lot to think about. So thank you. And this is actually our last program. So I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in to the Vancouver Art Book Fair. The fair website will be live until 6 a.m. Pacific time tomorrow at vancouverartbookfair.com. They're leaving it open later for international folks to check it out. And then it closes. So this is your absolute last chance to get those books. I know I've got a bunch of those books saved in my cart and I'm going to go and check out right now. There's also a ton of artist projects to check out. And please support the fair by signing up to be a member to keep these free and accessible. And I wanted to give a moment to give a huge thank you to Karayun, Youssef Bijlou. I don't know if can you just show yourselves behind the scenes people who've been doing the amazing tech magic. No, apparently no, it's not possible. I think we'll break it. But the Vancouver Art Book Fair team, Lisa Curry, Erica Will, Helen Wong, and all the ASL interpreters, all the folks behind the scenes who've really worked hard to create this fair. I said this yesterday, but it really is this like tremendous feat to pivot to, I think, what would have been an in-person fair to an online fair, and you've all done an incredible job. So thank you, everyone. And I also, it's just been an honor to get to talk to the people that I admire and love about books. So thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks. Thank you.